Alright, day 23 of the 30-day challenge to vlog every day for 30 days, share an idea every day. Today was a pretty long day. Went in for getting Kimji's visa for Europe, and then went and did some physical exercise, met up with Kimji's family, and took him out for a drink. And now back here, just knocked out some work. And it's again another late one. It's 10:15 p.m. I'm, I'm slacking on waiting till the very end to produce these. But the topic today will be a little bit on the war on drugs. It's something that I've thought a lot about and I've done a lot of research on. I mean, drugs in general, I've been always quite fascinated with humans throughout history. Pretty much from since humans existed, they have taken some sort of drug, whether it's caffeine or alcohol or psilocybin mushrooms or other plants that like DMT that exist in nature. There's always been something that intoxicates humans. I think there was also a society that starved themselves to get a change of consciousness. But anyways, that aside, I'll just focus a little bit on the war on drugs. A few years ago, I made a website called drugwarkills.com. I'll put a link in the description, but it just shares a lot of the research that I've learned through reading a few books and chatting with people. There's a really good book called Chasing the Scream on the history of the war on drugs. But to keep it short, this video, not to try to keep it under 10 minutes, basically the short of it is we kind of misunderstand what it is to be addicted to something. We tend to think addiction is caused by like a chemical hook in a drug. And we think that like the war on drugs is like prevents people from becoming addicts and getting people off the street doing drugs and make society safer, but it actually does the opposite. And it's kind of a counterintuitive thing because if you think about the war on drugs is like fighting people to not use drugs because people think like a society of people using drugs is a bad society. And that's mostly driven by the fact that there's a few people who use drugs and it ruins their lives. But in general, we don't particularly care about people using drugs. We care about people like overdosing or becoming addicted to it or becoming violent. And if you take something like alcohol, for example, like it's socially acceptable to overdose on alcohol where you're puking or blackout, which is very strange because if you look at other drugs where people do that, it's not socially acceptable at all. And we also don't really care about people drinking. We care about people when they become alcoholics because it ruins their lives, or we care about when people become violent or become criminals or whatever. But the short of this is that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is a connection. People who typically become addicted to drugs almost always, this is studied throughout research, is that they become addicted because they want to escape something in their lives. There's something in their lives that they're coping with. So someone may become an alcoholic because they're lonely, because they're depressed, because they're hiding something, because they can't communicate their feelings, because they have social anxiety. It could be anything, but addiction is almost always caused not because you shot heroin once and it hooked you. It's because you're escaping the present, you're escaping your current existence. And if you look at it that way, um, if you look at the war on drugs that through that lens, we shouldn't be fighting like making drugs illegal. We should basically be regulating them such that when people take them, they know what they're taking. And if there's more people becoming addicted, it's typically another symptom of something else in society, like maybe a depression epidemic, which is caused by some bad structure in society or bad functioning society, which is then causing people to use drugs, which I think is, for example, um, the fentanyl opiate epidemic that's going on, where it's killing a bunch of people. Sure, it could be caused because it's so easy to overdose on it, but a larger part of it is probably the fact that so many people are lonely in society or struggling financially or depressed or something else. But it's interesting because the U.S. has spent so much money. I think it's over $1 trillion over the last 100 years in the war on drugs, but it's actually the number one nation in the world for illegal drug use. And as you know, or a lot of people know who's watching this, the U.S. has a privatized prison system, and U.S. has the largest prison population in the world. It's a little bit under 1% of the population is in prison, and more than half of that is because of drug offenses. So there's clearly, if you look at the data, it's actually backwards. Like the U.S. is fighting it most, but we have the worst problem. We also have the biggest prison population. We're locking people in prison who are otherwise just normal people who happen to do a drug. Um, and it's kind of a crazy thing. And a lot of the world looks at the U.S. and thinks, well, what the hell is the U.S. doing? If you look at other countries where they leave it a little, where they regulate, like for example, Portugal had one of the worst heroin problems in the world, in not only for addicts but for overdoses in Europe. And I think it's in 2000 they decided to decriminalize them, decriminalize drugs, and legalize some of them. And what ended up happening is people basically, now today Portugal has like the least problem in all of Europe with this. I think Switzerland, a few countries in Europe followed suit. Like I think in Switzerland, if you're a heroin addict, you can shoot up as often as you want, um, whenever you want, with as much as you want, for free, paid for by the taxpayers at these injection sites where you're supervised. And what they've discovered is that as people get access to this drug as they need it, and then they get integrated back into society. So what they do is they'll go to, like, let's say you're a mechanic, they go to a mechanic shop or an auto shop and say, hey, if you hire this guy, we'll subsidize his wage for the next year. And and then the mechanic's like, of course. And what happens is that person gets reintegrated back into society because they're able to actually spend their time, working and connecting with people and bonding with people, instead of actually spending all their time and energy chasing their addiction. And what they found is that after like 2 or 3 years, people just stop taking heroin, and overall it costs the taxpayers less money to do that than it is to just constantly fight it and employ police and go out and um, you know try to fight this, because you can't stop it. I mean, you can't even keep drugs out of prisons. How are you supposed to regulate a society or an entire world of people who are going to use these drugs? And drugs themselves aren't bad. It's when people become addicted to them or overdose on them. That's a solid point. Like if we legalize or decriminalize cocaine, sure, cocaine use might go up, but actually addiction rates and um, overdoses would actually drop, because one of the reasons why people overdose is because they don't know what they're taking, or they're taking something which they don't think it actually is. So like if you're shooting heroin and you don't actually know you're taking heroin, and you know how much you're taking, your odds of overdosing are far, far higher. So I mean, there's so much more to be said about this. During the Vietnam War, I'll keep it short, but during the Vietnam War, there was a few 100,000 soldiers coming back from Southeast Asia where they were taking opium regularly, and the U.S. declared like a national emergency, or like it was a huge crisis that all these people were going to come back and they were going to be addicted. And when they came back from Southeast Asia, they, like, the vast majority of them just completely stopped. And the reason they stopped isn't because it wasn't available, because they could have got it. The reason they stopped is because they went from a place of being in war, which is like you need drugs to cope with, to being back in a civilized society where um, you have connection to people, you have connection to society, and therefore you don't want to escape the present. Um, so I mean, that's just like one story of many. But there's also like the rat park experiment, where like in the 70s they said they put a rat into a cage and they had cocaine, and then they had water laced with regular water, and then water laced with cocaine, and the rat always chose the one with the cocaine. And that was like in the 70s. Everyone's like, therefore, don't do cocaine; it'll kill you. And the rat would do it until it died. Well, then they redid that experiment, but they created Rat Park, which instead of the rat being alone in a cage, they put it with a bunch of other rats, a bunch of like toys and stuff. And then they did the same thing. They put the water, and then water with cocaine. And when it was in Rat Park and it had all these friends and connections to society, or to its own society, the rats actually preferred the water over the cocaine. So yeah, the short of it is that war on drugs is a major problem in the world. There's so much to be said about this, and there's so much to go on it. Um, it's arguably one of the biggest mistakes that governments are making. It's affecting so many people's lives. It's killing so many people. It's causing so much suffering. And again, drugs themselves aren't bad. It's when they're misused. And the way to prevent people from misusing them is to regulate them. And this has been shown time and time again. Wherever they've done the opposite of the war on drugs, it's actually worked. Where you decriminalize and legalize, it solves the problem. Study after study shows this, and why people keep chasing the war on drugs is because it's a very counterintuitive thing. Um, by not fighting the war on drugs, it actually creates less overdoses and less addicts. which is what society doesn't want, which is society wants. They want less of that. So yeah, I'll post a link to drugworkhills.com in the description for some more information on it, but that's the gist of it. I would also recommend reading Chasing the Scream or watching the TED Talk of the author of that, what's his name? Johan Hari, great author. He also wrote a book called Lost Connections, which was really good on the hidden causes and cures of depression, which is also a major issue in society now. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Study up on the war on drugs. It's well worthwhile. See y'all tomorrow.